Hi, my name is Jessica Nelson, and this is the Mental Health OT podcast. Today, I'm lucky enough to be sitting with Dr. Quinn Tyminski. She currently serves as an assistant professor in the program of occupational therapy at Washington University School of Medicine, where she also received her master's degree in occupational therapy in 2012. In 2017, she earned her doctorate of occupational therapy from St. Louis University. She served for 5 years as the occupational therapist for a transitional housing program for men experiencing serious mental illness and homelessness, and spent a year as the clinical director coordinating occupational therapy services and students. As part of her doctoral work, Dr. Tyminski introduced occupational therapy services to a local homeless shelter in 2018. She opened an outpatient student-run clinic. The Community Independence Occupational Therapy Clinic provides services to individuals experiencing homelessness. Dr. Tyminski's research focuses on improving occupational participation and quality of life for populations experiencing marginalization through providing occupation-based services targeted at improving life skills and community reintegration. She is also currently in the process of obtaining her PhD in education at Washington University in St. Louis. Today, we will be talking with Dr. Tyminski about her work with the homeless population, as well as her work running the student-ran occupational therapy clinic at Washington University. We will also be talking about some of the research she has conducted to help support her practice and her clinical skills. We will also be talking about creative avenues occupational therapists can utilize to promote occupational therapy and advocate for the profession, one of which being a TED Talk, which she actually gave regarding occupational therapy and how we can help to serve homelessness. I'm so happy and honored to welcome Dr. Quinn Tyminski. Hello, Dr. Tyminski. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, I'm excited as well. Why did you choose occupational therapy and what interests you about this field?
Yeah, I've gotten that question a lot, and the answer I always give is that I started sort of in college with a focus on like exercise science, athletic training. I was really interested in sports, and I really thought that's where I was going to go. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think my mom was a really big proponent and like, I don't know that that's really the path for you, Quinn. And she worked in a school district and she was like, we have this OT in the school district. You should come see what an OT does. And so I came and shadowed her school-based OT and I was like, this is really cool. And so
Mm-hmm.
from there, I got a chance to shadow more OTs and I sort of dove in having seen like a very limited settings. I saw school-based pediatrics and I saw like an outpatient hand clinic. And I saw acute care as when I went to the OT school. And then I got into OT school and my very first level one field work, like my very first semester of OT school was mental health. And I think that just like, oh my gosh, it just changed my world. I was like, this is awesome. Like I loved that it wasn't the same thing every day. I loved that population. And so for me, I think OT was just this chance to like not sit behind a desk, do something
Mm-hmm.
super creative, be out in the community helping people all the time. And so like when I initially got in, that's really where I started. And now I think for me, OT is like much more about like making a change at a systems level and like affecting change in people's lives, which I think was where I started, but in a much different way now. So it's interesting too how your career goals with this profession sort of evolve in the little bit over a decade that I've been doing this now.
Yeah, it's really interesting too, which I think I've talked about previously on some of the other episodes. I mean, OT just looks so different in so many different settings, and so like it's so confusing to people I think who aren't OTs to like define what we do.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Um,
I,
yeah.
I think that's one of the main problems with the profession in terms of like how we why the public has a hard time understanding what we do is because like they might have seen an OT in acute care, they might have seen an OT in pediatrics, but then when I'm saying like, oh, but I do OT in homelessness, they're like, I don't even understand how that works.
Mm-hmm. All the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you kind of go on this like whole thing, well, OTs, we make you or we help you to do what you want to do. And so anything can limit what you want to do. And then
Yes.
they're just like, okay, sure. They
Yes.
just like appease what I'm saying, I feel like, but it's a work in
Yes. Yeah.
progress.
Getting that good elevator speech and making it to like where people's eyes don't glaze over when you talk about it because it can be so like need and want to do. And you're like, they're like,
Mm-hmm.
that seems so nebulous. So really making it, I guess, yeah, like meaningful to them.
Yeah, yeah. Just like personalizing it. Like, well, what do you like to do?
Yeah,
And they're like,
exactly.
oh, well. So you kind of talked about it a little bit with like your focus a little bit shifting towards like really focusing on changing like the systems and stuff like that, which is super cool. I know that I've always kind of had that idea of like eventually I do want to get to a point where I am, I don't know, I guess I'm knowledgeable enough or like am equipped enough to like start to pursue work like that. You said that your first semester in OT school was like that mental health
Yeah.
semester. Did that kind of lead you into your interest in community based work?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so I had this. We at the time, WashU's program, and this again was 10 years ago. We had 1 week level one fieldworks 4 times, so one every semester. And so my very first one was at a place here in St. Louis that's transitional housing for men only who had serious mental illness, a lot of co-occurring substance use, histories of homelessness, histories of justice involvement, and things like that as well. There was an OT there who is still to this day a really good friend of mine. But so I went there for a week, and I sort of was like, this is what I want to do. Like we took the clients to the doctors, and we got to like, you know, be very functional every second. Like we were at the grocery store. We
Mm-hmm.
we, we took them bowling one day, and like I was like, this is fun. This doesn't feel like a job. And I know like that's why that's also what draws a lot of people to pediatrics. So it felt like the adult version of that, like getting to do almost adult play with individuals. And then I also just I felt like this was a population like that doesn't get a lot of attention. Like I really enjoyed like the sort of the systems aspect of it that I got to experience in mental health. And so, after that 1 week, I actually asked the OT there if I could go back and like spend some time there. And I did. I would go back like a couple times a month. I remember I went back to their Halloween party, and I really stayed in touch with that OT. But then in terms of my education, I really geared everything that I was doing towards mental health. Like did my master's research project on substance use and occupational participation, did my fieldworks in inpatient psych, but which is actually I like highly recommend if you're going to do community, because I always say like I think it's really important to see our clients when they're at their most like acutely ill, so that we can
Mm-hmm.
understand where they've been and the trauma they've experienced while they're inpatient, so that like we can understand the challenges they experience in the community. So I was able to gear then like my entire career essentially towards mental health after that point. So it was really pivotal to me, and then a sort of like seeking out these mentors who were really mental health folks who are the reason that my career is the way it is now. So that OT from the housing facility was one of my mentors, and then my faculty mentor, who was my mental health faculty mentor, are the two people that I credit for getting me to where I was. So I think all of those things were like the pieces of the puzzle that I was able to put in place after I had this aha moment of like, yeah, this is where I want to go, and this is what I want to do. And a decade ago, there was only 2 of us in my entire class of 100 who wanted to do mental health. So that was a kind of a very unique path.
Yeah, I feel like it still is. I haven't looked up the statistics, but I know from other people who have like talked to me about it, I think it's about 5% of OTs work in mental health. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's like between like 3 and 4%. But then like I just saw the number for community though is only at like 0.4% who actually work in community-based mental health, because a lot of those jobs are like in inpatient rehab. So I think that's a really interesting statistic that sometimes like gets thrown under the radar, is that like those community jobs are few and far between.
yeah, and I mean we'll talk about it later on, but like a big issue I think is like funding and just people not
Absolutely.
knowing what we can do.
Yes.
Um, but I do want to say that I definitely agree with you that if people do work in mental health or occupational therapists work in mental health, well, no, people in general, I think there's a huge benefit to working in like inpatient or acute mental health because, like, for me, how can you help someone if you don't and you don't if
Yeah.
you want to try to get the whole picture, I think. And I think that that's really helped me so far. I started at a state psychiatric hospital, inpatient state psychiatric hospital, and that's where I am right now. And it's really really eye-opening, I would say, to put it plainly.
Yeah.
But it's just seeing these individuals and like, I mean, this is like they're at their worst and they're at their lowest. Yeah, definitely, I think puts things into perspective.
Absolutely. I agree. I think that time that I spent, even though it was like 3 months, it was really transformative. And so, for example, like I was on a inpatient psych unit at a like a pretty well established mental health hospital that's pretty well known here in the US. And like I saw a lot of like restraint use, so like
Mm-hmm.
takedowns, and then both like medication induced restraints and physical restraints. And I think just like recognizing the trauma and like the distrust of the medical system that would then occur for individuals with serious mental illness who had experienced that has really led me to like changing the way that I practice then in the community, because I have sort of taken a lot of steps, and this is something I'm pretty vocal about like trying to mitigate power dynamics in the community between us and the clients, and like almost in a way like trying to distance ourselves as community OTs from the healthcare system. And sort of like I would say like my clients 100% can tell you what OT is. They will give you the most beautiful elevator speech that you ever heard. But I don't know if you ask them if I was a healthcare practitioner, if they would say yes. Because I don't think that they think of me as part of that system. And I think in many ways that's why we're able to have the relationship and the progress that we do, because they sort of like don't associate then community-based OT with the people who have sort of maybe inflicted that trauma or caused those issues.
Yeah. I mean, even while working at an inpatient facility right now, I feel
Mm-hmm.
like their relationship with me as like an occupational therapist is a lot
Yes.
different than their relationship with like the nurses or like the psychiatrists or stuff like that. So even while I'm working in this setting, I do still see kind of that disconnect of like the kind of the distrust with like other professionals.
Oh
And
yeah.
then like because my role is so different, and I think that that's just the nature of occupational therapy, and like the models we go by aren't like typically traditional medical type models. So I think that that's really seen throughout like how we do our job and how we do and deliver our work, which can help facilitate that relationship.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that that's why we need like inpatient OT, is so that, there is someone there who they can talk to, who they can rely on, who they can forge that relationship with, so that, that trauma or that experience can start happening then, and they can sort of recognize there is some trust that can be had there, and then that can transition. And my gosh, if we could ever have like a really smooth transition from an inpatient psych OT to a community based psych OT, like that would be incredible, because that handoff would be so essential. That doesn't,
Yeah.
as far as I know, exist very frequently, but maybe somebody out there is doing it, and I'd love to hear more about that.
There's room for progress for sure.
Yeah.
I also think that too, with like that relationship, I've noticed a little bit. It's still a work in progress. And I'm trying out kind of new things with like my approaches. Try like bridging that gap between my relationship and the client, and then like the client's relationship with the treatment team. Because I am technically a part of the treatment team. I mean, I'm a clinician. Like I do
Yeah.
sit in on like the treatment team meetings and like provide my input, provide what I'm seeing, like the strengths and like what they're doing well, what they're struggling with. But yeah, I think that our relationship with the clients can help bridge a better relationship with the treatment team as a whole. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. And then I would say, like, also at the same side of that, sometimes it's like education of the treatment team of like why our relationship with the client is slightly different. Cause I know that like we've had issues in the community where, for example, like we see a wider berth of clients than some of the like social workers or case managers are able to see, because they have limitations on their funding about who they can see. And so like when a client gets discharged from a certain program, like OT can still see them, and they're like, well, I don't, the case managers or social workers would be like, kind of like, I don't understand why you still have a relationship with this person. It's like, well, my therapeutic relationship doesn't just end because they were immediately discharged. Like this is someone I am supporting longer term. And so I think a lot of that education is also really essential to the treatment team, because they might not understand why our relationship looks different.
Yeah. Education both ways. I've learned that it's very important because a lot of times I think that at least coming in, I was like, oh, like I'm going to educate like the clients a lot and this and that. But then like actually being in that setting, you sometimes the staff need just as much education as the clients do about certain things. And like that's not to say that I don't need education about certain things that other professions can give to me. But I think I've definitely recognized the value of OT in this setting. And it's been really rewarding. So,
Yeah, actually, just to go off that, like one of the biggest roles that we've actually found for OT in these sort of community-based social service organizations, particularly when we're talking about the unhoused, but with like, mental health services too, is actually education of the other staff. Because the other staff are very often not trained to actually work with individuals with serious mental illness. And I'm not talking about the skilled staff. I'm not talking about like licensed clinical social workers or psychologists or psychiatrists. I'm talking about sort of maybe the case management teams or sort of the other personnel that exist
mm-hmm.
within the agency. A lot of them sort of don't have that highly skilled training. And so they'll say things like, well, I don't think that this client can do this because their cognitive functioning is really low. And so like we do a lot of training on like, well, like what is cognition and what can we do? Like here's what OT is doing and how can you like support what OT is doing around cognition, or like, what is trauma informed care and how should we be implementing it agency wide? And so a lot of that can also just prove OT's ability to be really successful in any organization. If everyone is sort of trained to a higher level, then OT doesn't seem to have to sort of take the brunt of some of those issues.
Yeah. And I think I've noticed too, more particularly where I've worked, a lot of the staff don't know our whole scope. And so I think
Yeah.
I've worked really hard to, anytime that I see something that an OT could like help with, I bring it up to the treatment team and I'm like, well, OT could conduct an assessment, and maybe I know for like a particular case, it was hard because we weren't sure if the client was experiencing like dementia type symptoms or if it was like more behavioral,
Mm-hmm.
because they would like continuously request like something. So it'd be like, oh, like I want this, I want this, I want this. And it'd be like, okay, like you can have it at this time. And then they would be redirectable. But then like 5 minutes later, they'd come back and say the same thing. And it would be like continuous. And so I was like, well, we could do like a cognitive assessment and see if they really do have issues with memory. And in that case, like maybe we figure out how to adapt things and provide maybe the staff with education that this isn't like a behavior, this is like a memory type issue. So,
Mm-hmm.
like getting frustrated with them or yelling at them isn't going to do anything. Or vice versa, if they weren't showing any issues with memory, then it's like, well, this is maybe like a behavior and they're just trying to like find someone to give them their desired. I mean, I'm sure that would be addressed completely differently as well. And so, kind of just saying like, well, we can kind of figure out or we can help to solve the issue. And then from there, like knowing what's going on, we can plan accordingly and appropriately with like what's the best intervention to address this. So it's just like
Yeah.
little things like that.
Absolutely. We actually are sort of in the end stages of conducting a study around like OTs and community mental health and around like what keeps people in that job, but also like what has people leaving that job. And that's actually one of the things that we found was that like very often we sort of get pigeonholed in certain agencies. We get like like I remember there was a quote from a participant who was like, I was known as like the toilet lady. Like we sort of
What a nice name to have.
right? Like we can be so much more. But then I think sometimes like I've actually been in a meeting where I've been like, oh, well, OT can do that and OT can do that. And I've
Mm-hmm.
actually had someone roll their eyes at me and I,
Yeah, no, that's
I'm like,
happened to me
I'm
too. They're like,
still
shut
gonna do
up.
it. I'm gonna like still, I always say like, I'm gonna still, talk about OT until I'm blue in the face,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that there's so much that we can do, and so often we just sort of get like put in this one lane and thought that like that's the only thing we can do, and so it's a little bit of both. It's like we don't want to get pulled in every direction, but we want to be able to use our skilled services in the way that they're intended to be done.
Yeah. And I think that also, and we talked about this a little bit before, but traditionally or like naturally OTs have a little bit more of a timid personality that I've noticed just with like majority of my classmates and like other OTs I've worked with. But I think that if we can really like dig in and advocate and just like recognize like our worth and our value and like what we can bring to the table and have like a little bit of courage and honestly be okay with like being because I've honestly too have had people where they're just like I'm like asking or I'm like saying, oh, well, we can do this or we can do this. And they're like,
Right.
Just like, can you shut up? But it's no, but it's important. And I think that like the people who and the professions who are there to really and who like truly care and want to provide quality care, it's important for them to know how they can utilize us, especially
Yes.
physicians. I know that my psychiatrist was asking if like an OT assessment would be appropriate for one of our clients. And I was like, I didn't want to say no, but like off the top of my head, I was like, I need some time to think about this. So like I thought about it for a couple of days and I was like, so this is what we could do and like this is how it would benefit. And so like but I was also like, it just depends on like what your goals are with the client because we can provide this and we can do this if this is like a goal that you have for them and
Yeah.
like this is like an avenue you want to go down. So when I saw her, I was like, I know it was like kind of long-winded and stuff like that. She's like, no, it's good. So you do think it will help. And I was like, yeah, but I will just say, I don't think I would ever tell you OT can't help a person. So, and then she
I'm not
laughed. I
going
was
to
like,
tell you
oh.
no.
Yeah. So it's take that with, take that how you'd like. Um,
Yes, I will say I have embraced the squeaky wheel gets the grease. You know, like
mm-hmm.
I don't think that I would have had the success in the community that I have had in like my life if I didn't like keep showing up, keep putting my face out there and be like, "Hey, it's me again. Remember me?" Like
The toilet lady.
I'm here again, and
Yeah.
that's truly because like when I talk about my work with the Unhoused, like it took us years for them to hire their first full-time OT, but that was because I showed up every single day and
Mm-hmm.
was like, "Hey, look, this is what I can do with the limited time I have, but imagine what you could do with a lot more."
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
now like, 7, 8 years later that we've been with that agency, we have champions in that agency. We have people who are as dedicated to OT who are not OTs.
I love
who
it.
will who will regularly be like, well, I think everyone needs an OT, and I'll be like, finally, like
The world is changing.
yes, but it took us a while to get there. So like, yeah, I think that you'll have moments where people will roll their eyes at you and they will tell you you're annoying, and you'll leave that meeting and you'll be like, oh my gosh, everyone in that meeting was so over me. But like, there is someone in there that's listening, and it will eventually pay off. So
Yeah.
that's always what I have to say about that.
That's that's good to keep telling myself
Yeah.
because I like sometimes I walk out of meetings and I'm like, oh, not mortified, but I'm just like, ooh, I don't know
Oh,
how they feel about me now. But
I still do that. I'm always like, was I
okay,
so silly in that meeting? Like, oh gosh.
I don't know if I would say silly, but that's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, that was me. That was me taming my language of what I
Yes,
actually say to myself.
I like it. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about your work with the student ran clinic that you do at
Yeah.
Washington University.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll give you a little bit of like origin story and like where it is now. So back in 2015, I was doing my clinical doctorate, actually at St. Louis University. And I was employed by that same agency I was actually talking about where I did that level 1 field work. I actually went back and got a job there. Um, and they were part operators of the largest homeless shelter here in the St. Louis area. And so I happened to be able to go see the shelter one day as part of my job. And I was like, I kind of walked in and I was like, there's not an OT here. Like, this is an extreme state of occupational deprivation. Like, there is no meaningful participation here. And I was like, this is my capstone project. Like, this is what I'm going to do. And so, we gave them 6 months of free full-time OT through fieldwork students as a way to sort of trial it out. And at the end of those 6 months, the other agency, so there were two agencies, the one I worked for, and then this other agency who sort of were both co-owning this shelter. And the other agency was like, this was the most successful service we've ever brought in here.
Oh,
Would you be willing to provide OT at like our main building? And I was like, yeah. So that was about the time I was transitioning to faculty. It was very serendipitous. So I was like, yeah, I'm thinking like this outpatient student run clinic model, and they were like, I was like, can we talk about space? Because I'll need space for this. And they happen to have like this beautiful space that was like a childcare center that they lost funding for. So it had like a private bathroom, it had a little kitchenette. Like it wasn't gray and boring. It was, like colorful and had chalkboards and, everything that you could want in an OT clinic. And they're like, we can give you this. This can be OT. And so we sort of started the student run clinic. I started with a really great number of students. I can't even remember now, probably like 6 or 7. And I will say, like, it has been, it evolved.
Mm-hmm.
My original vision for it is not the vision I have today, but like I couldn't have dreamed of what I would be today. We were going to do group sessions and we were going to do individual sessions. And at the time that we were starting this, there wasn't a ton of evidence out there on OT in the unhoused population. There wasn't sort of the amount of evidence that there is now. So it was like, we purposely chose to take clients from one of the programs that the St. Patrick's Center, which is the agency that I work with, has that serves individuals with serious mental illness and substance use. Because I was like, okay, I know the evidence here. Like, I know how to do evidence-based practice in this population. Like, we'll take these clients who are, also happen to be unhoused, but then have these sort of co-occurring disorders. We'll start there. And then we sort of realized like individuals were really hard to come by because the clients would come to group and then they didn't want to keep going to individual session. And so it was sort of like, it kind of evolved over years and years. And we got to the point where, like, after 3 years of us running these group sessions every single Wednesday morning, we come in, we run our whole 7-step protocol. The agency was like, we really like this. And as I was saying earlier, that's when I was like, well, this is what I can do because I'm, I am employed by this other position and this is my job and I can only spend this amount of time here. But if you all could find a way to fund full-time OT,
Mm-hmm.
you could have this all the time. And it would also be great to have like more help in the clinic because then we could take more students. And so in 2019, we wrote the grant and got the funding for a full-time OT. So we hired our first one then. We've had a full-time OT since then who sort of integrates with the clinic, which works so beautifully because then they're sort of able to help us bring clients into group and they know the clients better and they can sort of talk up group and it works really well. And then, now they're looking at expanding services to even more OTs. They're like working through grant funding to figure out how to do that now because they've just sort of embraced OT in this really wonderful way. But the clinic was a large part of that because so I take students for 3 semesters. So they start in summer and I take them summer, fall, and spring. So it's a full year.
Mm-hmm.
And they come every single Wednesday morning. So our program does both master's and doctoral students. So I actually take both master's and doctoral students. So my doctoral students have to do the additional research component. My master's students are just doing clinical practice. But they sometimes help with the research as they are interested in it. They come in, we do like the first semester, we do some trainings, we do trauma-informed care, we do crisis intervention, things like that. We talk about the population, we get to meet the clients. The clients at this point are like really familiar with the students. And every time that there's like a break between students, they're like, when are the students coming back? When are the students coming back? They love students. So, they know that they're students and they really end up enjoying them and they want to help them. So and then I throw them into running groups and I always tell them like, you're not going to kill anybody. The worst thing that you're going to do is you're going to have a really bad group and the clients are going to think it's boring or they're going to laugh at you or they're going to be mad, but you're not going to kill anyone with a group session. Like
that is so funny that you say that because I have definitely said that before. And I'm like, well, what's the worst that can happen?
Right. This isn't like there's no lines and leads. Like you're not going to pull out somebody's catheter. Like literally this is going to be, this is going to be pretty risk free in terms of like, the physical concerns. And so I kind of throw them into running groups and they all say like, oh my gosh, we were scared to death, but you were right. Like we got into it. And so then they write the documentation and it is amazing to me to watch these students start the very first semester to where they are by the end of spring. Oh my gosh, their ability to be flexible, to like, for clients to be like, I don't want to do that today. And then them like throw the whole protocol out the window and roll with whatever, like, something totally new. Their classmates can't do that. And they talk about like in other class experiences, they're like, they'll be like, we saw a live client in class today. And my other classmates had like, list pages of like, we're going to do this and then we're going to do this. And I kind of like went in there and was like, all right, hey, like, how are we doing today? What are we going to do? And I was like, yeah, because you've had this like real experience with clients. So it's honestly truly morphed in a way I could not imagine where the clients truly love working with the students. They look forward to it. They get so attached that every spring we do like a big going away outing. And we just did it a couple weeks ago for this graduating class. And then, the students learn so much and grow so much, and a lot of them do really want to do community-based mental health practice in the future. And so this is a great foundation for them to use that as a jumping off point. So it's just been something that I could not in my wildest dreams have ever dreamed up would still be working and functioning so well and being so beneficial.
Critically thinking is, I think, one of the most important skills for occupational therapists, just because our
Mm-hmm.
clients are so different. And so no intervention is like a one size fits all. And
No.
I honestly feel that across the board with all OT, but more specifically for sure in mental.
Absolutely. And I think like that's so hard to teach in a
It
classroom. And
mm-hmm.
you can do as many like standardized patients or even live clients, but like a one-off experience doesn't give it to you. Like we were running a group maybe like 3 weeks ago in our clinic. Luckily, these were students who were at the very end of their time in the clinic, because one of the clients, brand new client, we hadn't really worked with them before, starts telling in the icebreaker of the group, starts talking about how her son was just killed in a homicide like that week. And my student, oh my gosh, she did an amazing job. She's a mother herself, and she just like, she felt it, she felt the emotion, she let the client talk, but she limited it in a way that didn't, disrupt the group. She gave the client a hug. The client came back the next week and was like, that student changed my life. Like that was the person
Mm,
I needed in that moment. And like, that's not something I could ever fabricate, even if I wrote the script for that. Like
right.
that is the kind of education that students have to experience to really get. So yeah, that's the kind of clinical reasoning that occurs in those real life experiences.
Yeah. That's wow. That is really awesome. And invaluable learning. I was going to ask something
I'm
else,
so
but
sorry.
no, no, you're good. I'm sure it'll come back to me. But
Oh,
I did
definitely.
want to talk a little bit more like specifics of the population. So
Yeah.
obviously you said it's like homeless or like unhoused population, but like more so like what does that entail exactly? Like what's a profile of a typical patient that you see?
Yeah. So within St. Patrick's Center, sort of like the clinic itself doesn't have a ton of restrictions. It's just sort of like
Mm-hmm.
anyone who's unhoused, they have to be able to enter the St. Patrick's Center building, which means that they can't have been banned from the building, which generally means that they have had violent incidents within the building. So that's like really the only rule we have to follow. But other than that, like we now accept clients from a really wide variety of programs within St. Patrick's Center. St. Patrick's Center has 20 programs. So there are so many different types of clients. One of the main programs we do take from, though, is a women's night program. So it's a women's shelter, a 90-day transitional housing for women, a lot of whom have serious mental illness and histories of substance use, co-occurring trauma, justice involvement, things like that. So I would say normally an unhoused population would be largely men. But
Mm,
because we do specifically take from this program, we end up with a good sort of 50-50 mix in our groups that are, both men and women. We also do end up with a lot of clients who are on the LGBTQ spectrum. So we do have clients who are trans women, and we do have clients who identify as, gender nonconforming, which has been a really wonderful thing to see, because that is not always what clients don't always feel that they can represent those genders in shelters, because shelters are often operated in ways that are very black and white and very like this gender or this gender. And, if you're gender nonconforming, you have to pick one. So generally, older clients though. So most of our clients, I would say, are probably late 40s, early 50s. We see a lot of histories of substance use, a lot of sort of untreated physical concerns. So whether that be diabetes, we've even seen like hearing loss, a lot of really poor vision. We give out like we have like reader glasses in the clinic, and those are a hot commodity. Those are something that clients are really interested in using when they're in the clinic. But the biggest, hands down, across the board thing is decreased cognition. Most
mm,
of the clients that we see in the clinic are ones that are seen individually by my OT Kaylin, and she does a lot of cognitive assessments with them, and I would say 99.9% of our clients have a mild to moderate cognitive deficit. And that is due to histories of mental illness, histories of substance use, really high incidence of traumatic brain injury in the unhoused population. Like over 50% of the unhoused population reports having a traumatic brain injury, and I would imagine it's higher than that, as well as, like things like trauma and stress, which we know alter um, our sort of cognitive ability. So that is one of the biggest things, hands down, that we sort of see, and emotional regulation and things like that too. But like I said, wide variety of genders, races. In the city of St. Louis, you are 4 times more likely to be unhoused if you are Black or African American. So we do see a larger proportion of individuals who are Black or African American, purely because of historic housing practices in the city of St. Louis, redlining, and discrimination in the housing market. So that has led to generational poverty in our Black and African American communities here in St. Louis. But sort of other than that, the big thing that I would say that most of our clients have is the decreased cognition, and then sort of a wide variety of other experiences.
Yeah. With the decreased cognition, it sounds like, depending on like why it's decreased, a lot of the reasons you gave, like TBIs, you gave a lot more, but that was
Yeah.
the one that stuck out. Do a lot of the interventions you do, is it more kind of like adaptation and modification for that, or do you ever try to like rehabilitate or like remediate cognition, or both, or like what does that look like? How do y'all address that?
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit of both. So there's definitely some compensate, definitely like modify. We do a lot of environmental modification.
Mm-hmm.
The environments of homelessness are really not designed to accommodate anyone, truly. So a lot of environmental modifications, certainly a lot of compensation, some remediation. It really depends on the individual and where we're at. Some of our like higher level cognitive clients can do well with remediation, and I've seen some clients who have been really successful in being able to sort of like live independently and move out onto their own and manage their own IDLs, with some remediation techniques. So it really runs the gamut, but I would say the biggest sort of cross-sectional experience is environmental modifications. Like every single thing that we do with this population is focused on the context of homelessness. And so a friend of mine, Caitlin Sanovic, says it really wonderfully. She says that like homelessness is a context-based population, not a diagnostic-based population, because you don't necessarily
Yeah.
have a diagnosis of homelessness. So it is the environment that is often the barrier to occupation, which is true in a lot of populations, but there's no diagnosis here in a lot of ways. And so it's like, when we're cooking, what are the barriers to cooking? When we're even trying to do something as simple as like taking a shower, what are the barriers to that? So that is one of our major interventions.
And I guess, to me, I feel like it would be pretty hard to do environmental modifications or interventions when it seems like, if they are homeless, their environments are like changing constantly, and there's not like a continuous environment that you can modify. Can you talk more on that, and like what would that look like?
Yeah. So I would say that like, for the most part, most of the clients that you end up seeing in occupational therapy who are unhoused have some sort of, I'm going to use the term like stable housing in a temporary setting.
Okay.
So like rarely, because of the nature of like people who are unhoused in like a very transient setting, like what you're talking about, who like, don't have someplace stable, they're not often the ones that we're seeing in OT, because they're not really going to benefit as much. Whereas like a lot of the clients that we're seeing are in a 90-day shelter program. So their environments are going to stay consistent for 90 days. They're transitioning to housing, or, we might see someone who lives, like we had a client for the longest time who lived in an abandoned building, but he lived in the same abandoned building
Okay.
for years on end, and was very like stable there. And he actually had like a really interesting setup. He had like a propane tank that he used to run a heater, and he used to run a hot plate, and then he would come every day and get ice to put in his backpack to put his food in so that it would stay cold. He had a very like, but he was very stable in that. So like when you sort of think about the people who are more transient, the people who sort of come and go, they're just not as good of a candidate for OT, because what we're doing there is more like triage as opposed to like more long-term lasting interventions. And so I always think that that's sort of an important thought to have when we're thinking about like OT's role in the unhoused, and particularly because there are so few of us working in this population and there's so little funding, like where can we really be the most beneficial? And it's definitely going to be in places where the environments are more stable.
Yeah. That makes more sense. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that kind of brings up like a good point where people's perception of like the unhoused population is like that transient type population where they like don't have anywhere to go and they're just like kind of hopping from one place to another. But I think there's like a spectrum of, I guess, situations that they could be
Yes.
in. Yeah.
Yeah, there's
Um,
a, I won't go too deep into it, but we have like a wide variety of individuals who are unhoused. Some people are unhoused like very briefly. Some people are unhoused for a very long periods of time. And then some people, like, I think when we think about people that were unhoused, we think of like people who are panhandling, and people who maybe like have serious mental illness to the point where it's like untreated and unmedicated. And those necessarily like are people that we would probably not see in the situations we're in because they're probably not seeking any sort of engagement with homeless services at St. Patrick's Center. So they would sort of never get funneled to OT services. So it's sort of the people who are already seeking services who are like wanting to make the changes that we're working with. So yeah, that helps us have a better idea of like what this population is. And as we know, like there has to be a little bit of stability for OT because behavioral change, when we think about Maslow's hierarchy, like we have to have some
yeah.
basis there to move to the next levels.
Yeah. They have to be ready to receive it.
Yes. If we're working with those other, like if we're talking about sort of individuals who are not housed, serious mental illness untreated, like we're probably working at more of like a population level, more of like systems advocacy. How can we like, make sure that population is getting safety net care, things like that, as opposed to more of an individual level.
Okay. How do you prepare your students to work with this population and address these barriers? Because, I mean, as we said, working with this population, it's very not a direct path. But I think
Yeah.
creativity comes to mind, critical thinking, all of these skills that, as you said, they're kind of hard to teach, really.
Yeah.
So, yeah, how do you work to prepare them and increase their skills and competency?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of it's sort of like in vivo real time processing. So, like the students will write a protocol for their group. I will review it. And a lot of times, especially at the beginning, you know, they'll be like thinking, I'm trying to come up with like an example that I have. So they might want to do like a home management protocol. And so we're going to talk about like, okay, I think this is appropriate, but let's talk about like, what are the things that they're allowed to keep in the shelter? Like what are their exact environments? How may this look different from what you're traditionally thinking? And so it's a lot of times also like removing the stigma. So I think students come in thinking like, oh, I have to give all of this information to this unhoused population. And one of the first things I tell them is this population is incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly resourceful, and a great community. There is a great desire in the unhoused population to help each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so oftentimes, and that's the other thing I tell them is like, we have not been unhoused. We do not know all these resources. You giving them a list of resources is doing them nothing. So like, instead, a lot of times when we like, okay, like let's talk about what are the resources out there for X, Y, or Z, the clients will do a great job of be like, oh, I went to this place last week and I learned that they have this and like you all should go there. They do so much sharing. And so a lot of times like we give a lot of open forum for that and let it be like this community place and do a lot of like peer-based support and a lot of learning from each other, which also creates self-efficacy from these clients because they feel like they can contribute to, give back to each other. And so, it's those moments for students is thinking about like, do you need to go into this space and be the expert? No, you don't. Like you are not the expert here.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what you can go in and do. Like we can teach this task and we can bring, our expert skills in environmental modification and task analysis and all of those really wonderful OT things. But like we are not the experts in being homeless and they are the experts in being homeless. So let them guide you there. And that is really, really essential. And so, like I said, it's sort of like a little bit of like, we make missteps and then we talk about it. And the clients that are there know that these are students and they know that they're learning. And so, they're always really gracious about those moments and they don't let them sort of when their therapeutic rapport with the clinic itself, being me or the OT Kaylin. And so it is very much those moments where I'm like, you might want to think about X, Y, or Z, because I think that you're making an assumption based on the privilege that you have had inherently that everyone has had this experience, and that's not the experience of this client population. And that is very often where you have to go on this. And then I think that's the other big thing that the students come away with at the end is like their worldview is totally shifted. They're thinking
Mm-hmm.
about people's lives in a different way, people's occupational participation in a different way, systems and structures in a different way when they hear these stories of a client. And so that is something they learn case by case. It's not something I necessarily go in with a curriculum to teach, but we debrief. I give them feedback on the protocol, and then we debrief after every group. And I'm like, okay, how did that go? And they'll be like, I don't think that this part went well. And I'd be like, well, why?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, that brings up a good point. I think that I too have like assumed that certain clients like need certain things, when in reality that might not be the case. But like I just assumed that because that's traditionally like when we look at
mm-hmm.
certain populations, we're like, well, they're probably unhoused because of X, Y, and Z. So if I can plug these things in, then I can help them. But instead, I really like it's more like about listening to them and like letting them
Yes.
guide the intervention and just like plugging away as they bring up their specific issues.
That's like the unique role of OT in the homeless systems that don't occur in other areas of the homeless systems. Because I think, like you said, like homeless systems are designed to be very rote, like, right? Like, so you come into the homeless system, you do this thing called a VI SPDAT, which is like a service prioritization assessment tool, right? So you take this assessment, it tells you like, you get a score. Based on that score, this is the program you qualify for, rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing or whatever. And then you get placed in that program, and this is how we deliver care. Nowhere along that is it really personalized, is it really individualized. And so OT is the person that comes in there, and you get case management. But again, case management is still like a little bit of a rote process. OT comes in there and says, okay, this is client-centered care.
Mm-hmm.
What do you need? And like, I'm not the expert here. I'm here to walk alongside you. I have a little bit of expertise about this one thing, but it is your life and you have a whole lot of expertise about it. And that is why our feedback from clients is always, this is the only place I feel heard and listened to. This is the only place I feel safe. This is the only place I feel like I can be me. And I think that is why in these systems, it is so essential that OT to be part of this.
Yeah, and I think that speaks a lot to what you were talking about earlier, like shifting that dynamic and that relationship between like healthcare workers and clients is
Yeah.
everything that you're doing is empowering that client. And, as you said, like self-efficacy and all those like personal advocacy skills, all of those things, it sounds like you're supporting within that population.
Yeah, yeah. And I think sometimes it doesn't feel like that to case managers. It's like, well, they're relying on you too much. And it's like, we're actually teaching them amazing skills in being, like you said, self efficacious and being independent and being able to stand on their own 2 feet. You are going to be very impressed, like when we get to the end of this and they can say, like, I can do these things, because they have to feel like someone has supported them in doing it and not having people just do that for them.
Yeah. And this is kind of attached to that just with
Yeah.
interventions in general. For like myself as a new clinician, I did recently just graduate last August. So I'm still kind of,
Congratulations.
thank you, figuring out, who I am as a clinician and
Yeah.
building my skills. But I feel like I've gotten a lot better at, I guess, identifying needs or like figuring out like what the clients want, what
Yeah.
their needs are. But I am having a lot of struggles like past that, like, well, what interventions do I do now? Because obviously the reason that this is a need is not because it's easily attainable. Like, and with these, a lot of the clients that I deal with, even though they're like in an inpatient facility right now, they very well might be unsheltered when they leave. And so, and a lot of them have criminal backgrounds too. And so, issues that arise are like, work. So, we have people who are going to get discharged to a least restrictive alternative
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to be on social security income. So with that, that affects like how much they can work. But then also it's how do they find a job with the criminal history they have? And so it's kind of like as you said, I think if you don't critically think, you're just like, oh, well, like, just go on Indeed and like apply and like do this and like, here's a resume. But it's like, if it were that easy, I think that they could probably do it. But that's not necessarily the problem. The problem is more of that like systemic type.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
like, yeah, I'm just like, well, I'm not sure how to help, like, realistically. Like, I could make it seem like I'm helping, and I could make everything look pretty, and I could, like, teach you, like, these are the websites you can go on, but I don't know if anything would come out of that. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So, I think in that example, and then I'll give you an example from the Unhoused. So, I think in that example, like my first question for that client would be like, "Do you want to work? Like, is that something that really interests you?" And a lot of my clients will say like, "No, I don't want to work. That's not something
Mm-hmm.
that interests me." And I'd be like, "That's fine. You have income now because you're going to get, SSI, but we do have to have something to occupy our days. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so." What are we going to do to occupy our days? I don't know if where you live has a clubhouse model. We do here in St. Louis. We have Independence Center. It's a phenomenal program because it gives them like, so it's, a place where they can go. It's a drop-in day program. But it's sort of the people that work there and the clients are indistinguishable from each other. You can't tell who works there and who is a client. And there's all sorts of different things to do. So they can come in, they can take a workout class, they could work in the kitchen, they could work in the flower shop. Like there's all these things they
Mm-hmm.
could do. It's just a great place to have social interaction. It's a great place to have meaningful occupation. And so that's what I'm always talking to my clients about. What is your meaningful occupation? If it's not work, could it be volunteer? Is there a volunteer job that might really interest you? Like I said, our clients love to give back. Okay, if it's not volunteering, could it be education? Like, what is it? We have to have something to like engage our days. And so that's really like what I come back to. And if it is work that you want to do, yeah, you can still work on SSI. Like, yes, they're going to take like back $1 for every $2 you make, but that is still going to be more beneficial to you. And so do we need supported employment? Like what kind of supported employment programs are out there? What are you good at? Like, let's start finding those programs. And so there's a lot there that I sort of learned over the years, but I will tell you, like, I have been doing this 12 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a long time to get to that point. Like you're incredibly impressive for being out, not even a full year yet, because I definitely was not where you were. There's so much that I've like learned over the years to do, but you're right. Like very often we don't ask clients. And so the example that I was going to give is like, so in the unhoused population, there's like I was saying, you come in, you get the score, they house you. And the number of clients that get housed that don't actually want to be housed is incredibly
Mm.
high. We had a client once who was housed, and we got a call after about a month from the landlord. He was like, he cannot continue living here. He keeps sleeping in the backyard of the apartment complex. I went and talked to him. I was like, what's going on? He's like, I've never slept with a roof over my head. Like if I can't see the stars, I can't sleep. It's
Wow.
like, okay, like let's actually meet someone where they're at. And so like that's why I said that, like related to your work example. Okay, like do you actually want to work, or is that a goal that someone else is putting on you? And like what is the root thing that we have to have? So with that client, it would be like, okay, we have to have safety. We have to have some place that's safe. We have to have like, some sort of stability. Like, what are we going to have? And so I think that's where like OT is really beautiful at getting creative and like problem solving in a really unique way that like other professions don't think, because other professions sort of are like, this is the one way and this is the way that you do it, and there's no other option. And that's not the way our minds work.
Yeah. Going back to like that client that you were talking about, I think that is
Yeah.
like a perfect example of like our like us using our like privilege and us imposing like our expectations of like how you're supposed to live life onto like, that
Yes.
person, where it's like if they're happy doing this, like let them be happy and let's support them in that, instead of like lecturing them, or instead of like looking down on them or being like, well, you shouldn't feel this way or you shouldn't be living this way. So
Right. Which
yeah.
also then brings me to doing a lot of education with other professions. So, for example, law enforcement is a great. So, like when
Mm,
you run up,
mhm.
you run up against these system issues. I think that that's sort of like my like I think I've hit that point in my career where I'm sort of making the transitions from doing more like direct interventions to I feel like my new role is like advocacy at like a very high level. And so a lot of like what I'm doing is like let me tell you why this population is operating this way. Like, let's talk about how we can change the system. So like, no, law enforcement, your person who's sleeping outside and keeps coming back to that same place is not doing so because they're being difficult or they're being obstinate. I was actually talking to a law enforcement officer the other day. They were telling me that they have this client who will not leave this one area of town because he has an estranged daughter who lives there and he wants to be near her. And I was like, okay, like I don't work with this client. We were purely having a discussion, this law enforcement. But I was like, as long as he is not stalking her,
Mm-hmm.
and as long as there's no restraining order there, like let's talk about where is he harming someone? Like let's talk about, can we look at like housing him if he wants to be housed in that area of town so that he can be near his daughter? Like what is the harm in that? And I think so often there's this gut reaction from other professions of like, well, no, like we couldn't do
Mm-hmm.
that. Why would we do that? And it's like, well, why wouldn't we? Why couldn't we meet someone's needs?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, wow. Because I just feel like we have a lot of these type of issues at like the state facility where I work, where I mean I work somewhere where it's literally been open for 150 plus years. So it's very like dated ways of looking at
Sure.
things, dated models, dated like approaches. And yeah, I think that there's not enough people to challenge that. And
Oh
so
yeah.
a lot of times our clients pay the price, unfortunately, and we're unable to provide them with the support and the care that they deserve. So,
Yes, absolutely. Every OT that I know that works within these sort of, and I'm specifically talking about community because I'm sure this exists in every other area of OT too, but in community mental health, goes out of their way to fight systems. I know that my OT Kaylin is regularly calling the hospital and being like, you cannot discharge this person to homelessness again. Like, what is your discharge plan? That is not in her scope of practice, like, or not in her scope of her job, excuse me, it is in
mm-hmm.
her scope of practice to be doing that, but that is what is best for this client. Like those are the moments. And I think that's also what leads us to high levels of burnout. But that's a whole separate discussion. But we do it for our clients because
There is
that's what we have to do.
that. So, with the interventions that you guys provide in this place, do you feel like a lot of them are like sustainable and meaningful, or do you feel like they're more like temporary fixes to a much larger problem?
A little bit of both, I would say. Like, I do think that in terms of our clients, their occupational participation, I do feel like those interventions are sustainable. Like the ones that come to mind are like things around like emotional regulation and coping skills. I have seen some incredible progress in like sustainable interventions and clients implementing those in ways like across their environments and in other contexts, and being able to take what they learned in OT to other places and saying saying to law enforcement, like, I need you to stop. I'm in the red zone right now. And I know that I'm going to do something bad. So I need to take a minute to cool off. Like, that's an incredible intervention that like Kaylin, my OT, implemented and we saw carry forward. And like, good gosh, that's amazing. At the same time, there's a lot of stopgap fixes. And so I think it's a little bit of both. So I always say to those of us working in this sort of area of practice, like, take your wins with your losses. Like, take the moments where you see those victories and the moments where we really feel like we've affected change and be like, I did something awesome today, because those other ones are really hard when you try something and it changes, and you know you've got to do it again later because of the systems. I think it kind of evens out in the end. But we live another day to keep fighting.
Yeah. And when I was in school for occupational therapy, we also had like a clinic, and we served a lot of clients who were like lower socioeconomic, who didn't have like healthcare. Um, some might have been homeless. I feel like majority maybe weren't, but they were still like on that lower spectrum.
Sure.
Um, and I don't know. I guess I always felt like we were doing like the standard interventions of like emotional regulation and joint protection and this and that. But to me, sometimes it kind of just felt like we were there just to like practice our skills,
Mm,
and it didn't feel all the time super client centered or like, well, we're telling you
okay.
this, but I'm not exactly sure like how to tailor this to like make it meaningful. And it just feels like we're kind of doing this repetitive type thing
Yeah.
to make us feel good and like, oh, we did something to help like this population in need, but then it's also like, well, did we help them? So I always like struggled with that a lot, working specifically with like populations like this, and like that balance
Yeah.
between like something can look great, but like is it actually great, and how to like make sure that what you're trying to do is actually achieving
Oh
that.
gosh, yeah. So I think that that's a really important point. So I see a lot of that in OT. I see a
Mm-hmm.
lot of moments, particularly the unhoused population, where people want to provide OT services in this population and are going in without an understanding of all of the complex needs of this population. And so the services that are being providing in many ways are at best not helpful, at worst harmful.
Yeah,
Um,
it feels
and
like insensitive almost too.
Yes, 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 yes. And so whenever I talk about this, and I give this lecture on some semi-regular basis, the first thing, like, and then one of the biggest things for us has been truly to have a strong partnership with the agency that we work with. So like I've mentioned St. Patrick's Center many times. This is an agency that I have now been with since 2015, so almost a decade now.
Mm-hmm.
And there are staff at the agency who I've been working with that long. So like we really have, we always say like, we are not here to do what we want to do. We are here to meet your need. So it is always like every group that we run in that clinic is because the clients asked for that group, or the
Yeah.
staff at the agency said, this is what our clients need right now. We are not choosing those interventions. The clients are choosing those interventions. And so I think that's number one, is like, we are truly saying like, what is it that we can, like, what need can we meet for you right now? And and then like I said, like, you know, we're bringing a little bit of information, but they're also bringing a lot of information. So that's sort of like part one. And that's also true with my research. Like, I am generally not doing research for research sakes, because that is incredibly harmful to this population who has had a lot of research done on them over the years. And then the other part of it is, and you were saying, like, if you're delivering an intervention and it just doesn't feel like it's worthwhile, like, this is a population where you have to be willing to pivot. So like that example I was giving a while back with the client, or the client who had her son, you know, murdered earlier that week. That is a moment where, like, whatever you were planning on NFT that day doesn't matter. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that is not what that client needs that day. If you were going to do energy conservation that day, that is not what that woman needs. Like, so that is one of the biggest things that we also learn. And that's that skill, back to clinical like reasoning, is no, it is absolutely appropriate to throw everything that you're going to do out the window and actually sit in that moment with that woman, because what she needs is a listening ear. What she needs is emotional support. She needs to know, like, you know, she needs to grieve. Like, that is what we are here for. And like, those are the really important things. So for us, it is always about throwing our plans out the window, truly meeting the client's needs. There have been times that, like, we have been told by the staff at the women's shelter where I said we get a lot of our clients, that like there's some inner like personal conflicts happening at the women's shelter, and they're like, can you all do anything about that? And we have literally like scrapped the whole group that the students were planning on running that day, and been like, okay, we're gonna do like interpersonal communication in group, and like we sort of like hash it all out and address it right then and there, and like work through how, like, what is better interpersonal communication. Because I think that is the most harmful in student run clinics, when it's like, okay, I want the students to learn this skill, and so they've prepared it, and where that's what's going to be delivered, and like it doesn't matter what's going on with that person that day. um and that's not sort of best practice. And so I say all this to say, um there's a group of us who work in the unhoused, who are come together and putting together a research paper right now about like best practices in particularly capstones, because we see this a lot in capstone planning, where people want to work in
Yeah.
the unhoused for the capstones, and we see kind of really harmful plans because they're not being delivered in a way that is sensitive to the clients, where the person who's delivering it has had all of this training, who has this understanding. They're not being mentored by someone with this this understanding. And so this is something that we are really passionate about, is like, if OTs are going to do this, we're going to do this right, and we're going to do this well. And that means that, like, we're not at the forefront of what's happening. The clients are at the forefront of what's happening. So I'm like, that's my piece on that. But I'm really glad you brought that up, because I do see that a lot.
Okay, that makes me feel better, because I don't know. It just felt like sometimes it was like I was the only one who like saw it that way. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the research that
Yeah.
you have conducted, how your research has impacted and informed your practice.
Yeah. So, I mean, the things I would say about our research is just that, like, I sort of do research in two buckets with the unhoused population. Everything that we do is either one, to better understand the occupational participation of this population. So, like, we can understand what their day-to-day lives look like, or better understand how we can serve them and then the benefit of OT services. That's really all we do. Everything that we do has to be run by the organ. So we have to have approval from the program committee at St. Patrick's Center to do it. And we're very particular about what we run and why. We've had, like, this was an agency actually that was very distrustful of academic institutions when I first started working with them. They had a lot of psychiatric folks come in from the School of Medicine, do drug studies with their clients, and then leave them unmedicated. And so they were like, I don't really trust academic institutions. And so I really had to build up trust with them, and I had to consistently show them that I had the client's best interests in mind, and all of these research that we were doing was really for best practices and to, like, further demonstrate that. So a lot of what we have looked at has been around ways to better serve our clients. So we did a really large scale study around, like, menstrual hygiene and, like, the occupation of menstrual hygiene when you're unhoused, and what does that look like, and, like, where do you get products, and where do you change products and things like that, because that was something that, like, we didn't really know a ton about. And so that has changed our practice, because now we have menstrual stations everywhere. We actually have one in the clinic where there's free products. We hand out free products. We make sure that the clinic is a safe place to change products. We've done a lot of education in the women's shelter around products and safe places to change products and things like that. And then another one that we're just at the end of and is in review right now with a journal was looking at LGBT experiences in shelters. So we sort of did a comparative case study. We looked at two sort of individuals who identified on the LGBTQ spectrum, and we purposely chose shelters that weren't designed for LGBTQ individuals. There's a lot of, like, LGBTQ youth shelters out there, but that's not, like, we chose these shelters that were faith-based so that we could see the experiences. And so, we wanted to know, because where that will go will be, like, how do we change these processes, and how do, there are clients right now in the women's shelter who identify as male. And so, how are they changing their processes? How are they making sure that those people feel welcome, and that they're not discriminated against, and that, everyone feels like they have a space? So that's a big one as well. Understanding, I'm trying to think of some of the others we've done, understanding, like, health of this population, understanding, like, the barriers that exist. I know one of the ones that you and I were talking about earlier is our sort of a health management study, where we did a bunch of interventions with a client around health management and maintenance, and trying to improve this client's health, which ultimately were not successful because of sort of the barriers we saw in the systems. And I think that was a great illustration and really important to put out there, because, like, OT has such a role in improving the health of this population, but it can't be done, like, in a silo. We have to, like, I'm staunchly against people sort of seeing OT as, like, the silver bullet or the solution to health, or solving homelessness, because that is by no means what we are. We are a tool. We are a great tool that can be added. And without us, I think we're going to have a really hard time sustainably housing individuals who are chronically homeless, who have, homelessness with an associated physical or mental disability, and, the cognitive deficits. I don't think that that's going to be possible without OT. But I don't want there just to be this misconception out there that, like, we're just going to throw OT at it and everything's going to fix it. No, the systems and the structures have to change with us, because we're still fighting an uphill battle. And so that's just a sort of, like, a brief overview of the research, but essentially, like, all of these things to help us argue our fight better direction, like, evidence to prove why we're saying the things that we're saying, is really what we're doing, because everything that we do allows us to ask for changes, allows us to put policies in place and use evidence to support it, or help get grants to do that. And so that's a lot of the work that we've done.
So, in regards to the menstrual study,
Yeah.
it sounds like you've kind of changed, I guess, what you offer in, like, the building itself that you work in to help support. As far as, like, going a step further, I mean, you mentioned, like, where would it be safe to change these products and stuff like that. And it is interesting, and I'm interested for your take, because even like at my place of work, when I've had discussions with people, they've been like, well, sometimes we don't always have access to a bathroom. And like, if you try to go into a store, a lot of times it's like no public access, or like you have to buy something. And so
Mhm.
what do you say to those people, and like what's your solution to that, or like how do you help support them in those issues?
Yeah, so we really try to identify like what are some places that we know we will have access to bathrooms in, and like what are safe bathrooms, because clients talk about bathrooms that are unsafe. So like even a bathroom that like would have a single stall door, so you go into a bathroom and it's like a single stall. They don't feel comfortable a lot of times just locking that door. They want to lock the main door to the bathroom so
Mm,
that like no one can come through that. And so, like from an OT standpoint, like, okay, let's identify the bathroom sort of on our daily route that we can use to sort of lay out our plans. And just like you would do anything else, let's plan out like when we're gonna change. And like if we know it might be a while, can we wear like maybe a heavier pad or something like that so that we don't have to worry about leakage. Making products available is huge, and talking about like what are the products available. I mean, we had clients in this study say that they go to the emergency department to get products because they do not know where else to get them.
wow.
So just, having them available, like we just have them like open and available in the OT clinic so that any client that comes down there can take them. The other thing is like I was saying, not assuming the gender of a person and assuming that they do or do not menstruate. And so we do fight a little bit of an uphill battle because our agency is a Catholic agency and is tied to Catholic charities. And so there are
Mm-hmm.
times we have to fight policies, but like, really recognizing that like these products should be available in both men and women's shelters, because we're seeing people who menstruate in both shelters. And so that all of those things are coming into it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you actually did a TED Talk not too long ago.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just wanted you to be able to talk about, well, first, like, what was that process like? Why did you decide to do a TED Talk? How do you even decide to do a TED Talk? Like, yeah, all the things around that. I'm interested to hear.
Yeah. So how I decided, I don't know, it was like a total whim, but like I think realistically, I was looking for a way. So I kind of felt like, particularly in the unhoused, this, and I sort of mentioned it earlier, there's a lack of funding and a lack of knowledge around what OTs do. But the unhoused is a very like political topic. It's something that you see in the news all the time, but you
Mm-hmm.
rarely see
Mm-hmm.
the recognition of OT's role there. And so I was like, I really think that I need to get the word out about this outside of sort of the traditional academic circles, outside of publishing, because that only does me so much good, or outside of presenting at these conferences. And so I happened to cross the TED Talk, the St. Louis TEDx information one day, and I was like, all right, like let's try this. And so it was just such an interesting process because so to apply, you get two 300, no, I'm wrong, two 100 word paragraphs. One is about what is your topic and why is it like necessary, and one is why are you qualified to talk about your topic. From there, they got like thousands of applications. They pared it down to 24 of us that got called in to do a 3 minute, like modified talk, basically. Do 3 minutes on your topic and answer those same questions. What is your topic? Why is it necessary? And why are you qualified to talk about it? And then after that, they chose 12 of us to actually do the TED Talks. But the really interesting thing is, and I didn't know this until I actually went through the process, it's 6 months of training to give a TED
Mm-hmm.
Talk. And actually, when you give a TED Talk, most of them, there are a few of them, but the one that I did is completely memorized. You do not have a teleprompter at all. It is totally memorization, which was very scary to give like an 18-minute talk totally from memorization. But it's 6 months of training with acting coaches, people teaching you about like what is best practices in like storytelling, what is best practices in your PowerPoint, like how should your pictures look, what's the most eye-catching, things like that. You give this talk over and over again to the people in your cohort, and they give you tips on like where's your body position and like where's your hook. And so that was just such an experience too, in learning like how to public speak and how to like give a speech in a way that is really engaging and brings people in. And then actually doing it had a way better reception than I could have imagined. I think it's like up to like 6,000 views on YouTube, which seems small, but I think in the OT world, that's a decent,
Yeah.
decent number. And I know that like a lot of OT schools use it in their like mental health classes because it does talk about what is OT's role. But I think in some small ways it's getting some of the reach that we wanted. I have a friend who's in Colorado, and she wrote me. She works in the Unhoused as well, and she wrote me and said that some staff at a library near her saw the TED Talk and then reached out to her because they were like, would you be willing to like start this kind of program like for the unhoused that come into our library? Because I see that like OT can have a role here. Like,
Mm-hmm.
do you know anything about this? And she was like, oh my gosh, yes, it's a friend of mine. Like I'd happy to do it. And so she's sort of developing this program as it is. And that was really what I wanted from it. I wanted people out there to see like, yeah, like we have this role that no one's talking about, that no one knows about, and sort of develop programs from it. And if nothing else, people being able to use it as like fodder for starting their own program, like to be able to reach out to a program and be like, hey, I'm really interested in OT. Here's a TED Talk you can watch about like what we do.
Yeah, right.
um, so yeah, so it was a real adventure from start to finish. I learned a lot. It was not easy. Let me tell you that. It was really hard. But it was well worth it.
Yeah, and it's really cool that like you literally did that for that reason and you were able to like see in real time it happen with your friend in Colorado. And I could imagine that,
Yeah.
I mean, for you especially if you're like someone who's getting more into like advocacy and trying to like change these systems, like the skills you learned from that training are invaluable and skills that you can take on when you're speaking to different populations who hold maybe a little bit more power and who can enact the changes that you want to see.
Yeah, that's a really strong recommendation I have actually. If you're someone who is really interested in advocacy and doing a lot of work at like systems and structures level, I would recommend some public speaking courses and some like communications courses. So my little sister actually is she works in communications. She's actually like a national champion in speech and debate, and she does a lecture for one of my classes on public speaking. And she's someone I have her look at every speech that I give, and she helps me like rewrite it, and she does an amazing job. But there's so much that I've learned from people who are actually in the like communications and public speaking world that I think that we don't get as OTs, in terms of like how long do people actually pay attention, and how do we like what do we do with our hands and things like that are one of the biggest trainings that I have sort of added into my life.
That is very cool. And not many people get to say that they have done a TED Talk. I thought like I don't know. I feel like when people like hear TED Talk, they just are like, my gosh, and this must be the smartest person in the world.
Yeah,
So,
I remember after the audition, I was like super nervous, and I told my husband, I was like, this is like a real mixed bag. Like, if I don't get it, I'm like totally okay because I'm like scared, about it. But like, also, it would be really cool because I feel like this is really bucket list to say I did a TED
oh,
Talk.
100%. That's so cool. Would you recommend, I guess, or like, do you know of any other like avenues similar to a TED Talk that you would say could like disperse ideas?
Yeah, yeah. I actually went to a really cool presentation at the Occupational Science Conference, the Society for the Study of Occupation, this past fall in St. Louis. It was here, by Jen Soros and Carla Reese, who run the podcast on OT and sex. I can't think of the name of it at the moment. It's escaping me, but they're phenomenal. But their whole talk was on like how do we get our research out in innovative ways.
Yeah.
Podcasting is a great way to do that. Like podcasting reaches the masses in a totally different way. Blogging, social media, all of those things are really great. Like anything that I think gets us out of our traditional academic circles is really wonderful. Op-eds for the news is also cool. We just have to get out of our traditional, like, and I think like this has been a product of the way academia has been structured, that like we only get credit for doing things that are peer reviewed, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I've given a TED Talk, and I don't think that counts that much towards promotion compared to like if I publish a paper. So that's part of the structure, but like we have to get out of this idea that like the thing that matters most is publishing. Yeah, that's important and we need it, and it's important that other people look at our evidence and they say, yes, this is good evidence, but we also have to take that evidence and put it out there in a way that is really beneficial. And then, thinking about like when we do publish. So I've just published with a really phenomenal group of colleagues recently, a really important paper around professional behaviors and the impact of that on students of historically minoritized backgrounds. But we chose to publish open access, even though it was really expensive and none of us had the money to do it, because we
Mm-hmm.
wanted everyone to be able to access it. We wouldn't want it behind some paywall. So things like that.
Yeah. Well, good for you for doing that.
We
Honestly.
all spent $200 of our own money to do it, let me tell you.
Well, I'm sure that people will be grateful
Fingers
for
crossed.
that. But I do agree with you. Like, once we can kind of get outside of like our own community and figure out like avenues to like reach the masses or like the general public, I think that's where we'll see like the most change. Because like people who we're talking to already, like, it's like preaching to the choir.
Yeah, let's quit telling OTs about the wonder of OT, right?
Exactly. So yeah, things like that are not exactly like academic, but like more, I don't know, would you say like fun or like be a little bit less serious, like podcasts or
Yeah,
TikTok
like
or social
accessible,
media?
like
Mm-hmm.
yeah, things that you would like enjoy reading. Like no one's gonna pull up a journal. Maybe somebody's gonna pull up a journal or be like, I can't wait to read this journal article. But for the most part, that's not the way
Probably
that
not the
we
people who need to know it are the ones who are doing that. So
right.
yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And I think too, with that, a lot of people maybe like OTs or stuff like that maybe just feel like they're not qualified or like they're like, well, who am I to like create posts or like do this for OT? Like, what do I actually know? And like, this should be someone else doing it who is more knowledgeable or has more experience. But I think obviously we don't want to act like we know everything, but at the same time, like recognizing our worth and like recognizing that we do have things that we can say.
Yeah.
And yeah, we have.
If not you, then who?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, well, I think those were all of the questions that I've had. Would you like to talk about anything else or have any closing remarks or anything?
Gosh, no, I think we covered so much. I feel like I've had a chance to say a lot of really important things.
So, thank you. This
Yeah,
was
thank
really
you.
enjoyable. I feel like I learned a lot. So,
Same here.
hopefully, the people who listen feel the same. We will see.
Yes. Yes, and thank you so much for having me. Like I truly, truly mean like you are wise beyond your years and being where you are less than a year into practice, you're gonna do amazing things in your career. I was nowhere near as put together as a new practitioner as you are. So I can't wait to see how all of this takes off.
Well, I appreciate that. It was a pleasure getting to talk to you. Um,
Absolutely.
and I will let you go.